your point is that to deal with a situation like we may have seen with the Cheryl Miller case, that's why EAPs, employee assistance programs, were created. Let's dig into that a bit.
Exactly. One of the unfortunate realities about our local culture, or the way we do things here, is that we often are reactive. So only when a situation happens, some kind of catastrophe happens, then we say, well, okay, how should we deal with this? All right, and we're not very proactive. Employee assistance is there as a profession, a worldwide, internationally recognized profession, to deal with workplace incidents that affect any employee's well-being, okay? Whether it is supervisory, managerial, ordinary worker, no matter whom it is, all right? So I think, first of all, what I'd like to do is to define exactly what an EAP is and maybe clear up some incorrect notions people have about what it is. And I'm quoting directly from the International Employee Assistance Professionals Association. They have a website and so on. And it defines an EAP, Employee Assistance Program. It says an EAP is a workplace program designed to assist, 1, work organizations in addressing productivity issues, and 2, employees in identifying and resolving personal concerns. And it goes on to list some of those concerns: health, marital, family, financial, emotional stress, and so on. Any issues that may affect job performance. So the first thing I want to highlight there is that EAP is not just about counseling when something happens to somebody, which is the reactive side that we are accustomed to. It is also and primarily about assisting work organizations in terms of employee productivity.
Okay, so that's what an EAP is.
Yes.
Now, we know that there are private companies that have certified employee assistance providers attached to them.
Yes.
But what about the public service? What does it look like there?
Okay. There has been an initiative, and I would never say that I'm qualified to talk about this in depth, but there's an initiative. There's actually a document here that was issued by the Chief Personnel Officer's Office some time ago, and it's the Employee Assistance Program Policy. Now, I know from being one of the persons shortlisted to be able to provide services that this initiative to provide an EAP for the entire public service is something that's been ongoing for some time. But as of today, as far as I know, it has not been enacted as yet. So there is no official EAP for the public service.
But public service entities would have this particular policy document as reference when they're dealing with scenarios that call for the use of an EAP provider. I
would say ideally that's the way that it should be, but to say that each person within each ministry or each division and so on has been, thoroughly briefed on the contents of this policy and is very, very well versed with it and procedures and so on, I can't say that that has necessarily happened, simply because the policy has not been rolled out. Hasn't been enacted as yet.
Okay, let's look at the Cheryl Miller case.
Yes.
Specifically, you're saying that one of the options that could have been identified as opposed to going the very dramatic route of calling in the mental health officers from the psychiatric hospital at St. Anne's was to call in an EAP provider. But given the scenario that was painted in the media, it sounds as though it was a really dramatic situation that took place on that morning, which would have informed the decision that was taken by the supervisory staff at the ministry in question. And the rest is history, as it were.
Okay, one of the challenges with this particular situation and assessing it, because I've done a fair amount of reading different accounts of what happened, and that is the problem right there. Every account that you read, depending upon the perspective or who has been interviewed, you're getting a slightly different story. So at this point in time, I can't say that there is a definitive version that's publicly available of the sequence of events as it happened. All I can do is that I can cite what should happen, what procedures should be, depending upon what circumstance actually took place. But we don't know exactly what happened. And again, depending upon which perspective you get, you may get a different version of the sequence of events. All right? What I can say, though, is looking at the outcome, which is the length of time that the employee was detained, it would appear that there was some belief that there was a very serious cause to have detained the employee for so long. Okay? I don't know about the results of the assessment or evaluation or any evaluations that would have been carried out on the employee, but again, from the outcome, it would appear as though it is a serious case.
Now, we haven't heard from the Psychologists Association on this issue, but the Psychiatrists Association, they've put out an official statement in which they indicate that they are satisfied that there was a proper assessment done, which necessitated the lady in question being kept beyond the initial 72-hour period outlined in Section 15 of the Mental Health Act.
Okay. The difficulty I have with Section 15, and I am not at all representing or trying to pretend to be a lawyer or any legal mind, but I am simply an employee assistance professional interpreting this act as best I can. The particular difficulty with using Section 15 is that Section 15, and I'm quoting from it, deals with a person found wandering at large on a highway or in any public place and who by reason of his appearance, conduct or conversation, a mental health officer has reason to believe is mentally ill. I'll stop there. The first part of that statement, a person found wandering at large on a highway or in any public place, I think that's the contentious area right there. That's one.
One of the definitions that they're arguing is that a public service office can be considered a public place.
Maybe so, but then I guess the person had to be found wandering at large, right? Because it also says that. And I think even more critically than interpreting that first part of the first subclause under Section 15, lower down, a person, just now.
Number 4.
Is it number 4?
Yeah, a person who has been admitted to a psychiatric hospital or ward under subsection 2, which is under a hospital director, psychiatric hospital director, shall not be kept for more than 72 hours unless the director or the authorized medical officer is satisfied they need further care and treatment. And it's being argued that this is why she was kept for such a long period. That's according to the statement issued by the Psychiatrists Association. Again,
I will leave that up to the powers to be. We're dealing now with a situation that has happened, and it is being tackled, looked at from a legal perspective as to whether the actual acts, clauses within the act were contravened or not. And I would leave that discussion up to the persons best suited to do so.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's go back now to your point that bringing in an EAP provider may have been an option that the authorities at the ministry could have explored.
Yes.
What would have been the chain of events if they had done that?
Okay, I will talk about that. Now, as I said before, just want to give a little bit of context again. The true purpose of an employee assistance plan is not simply to be available for counseling when an employee has an issue, whether it is suggested that they go or whether they go voluntarily. In most organizations where there's an EAP in Trinidad and Tobago, that's what people are most accustomed to. So they think of the EAP as, I'm under stress, I'm having difficulties with my marriage, I'm having difficulties with my supervisor or boss, I will go to the EAP, okay? Or there's the case which was highlighted, I think, by the president of the PSA this morning, where he was talking about if a person's work performance has deteriorated, they can be referred by their supervisor to the EAP if there's a suspicion that there might be some personal reason why their work performance has deteriorated, all right? So that's what we're accustomed to hearing when we talk about EAP. However, there's the other side of EAP, which is also very, very important, you don't hear enough about, which is the assistance to the work organization itself in maximizing the productivity of employees, okay? So, and that takes place from two different levels. There is the proactive level, where we're speaking about creating a healthier workplace environment, we're speaking about employee wellness, we're speaking about policies and initiatives to encourage employees to be well, to look after themselves, and to live, better lifestyles, not just physically in terms of diet and exercise, but mentally and in terms of the emotional stress as well, okay? Then there is the consulting side of the assistance to work organizations, where something like what happened with Ms. Miller happens, and the EAP is there, ready, available, very importantly, all right, at quick notice, at short notice, to advise on what should happen next in terms of dealing with the situation.
It's a classroom session on today's edition of Ctntworld.com. We're looking at the Cheryl Miller case through the context of employee assistance programs. Our facilitator today, certified employee assistance provider Daryl Joseph. We'll be back after this break. We're back here on Ctntworld.com in a bit of a classroom session today. Our facilitator for the discussion, psychologist and certified employee assistance provider, Daryl Joseph, no stranger to Ctntworld.com. We're looking at the Cheryl Miller case, which has just captured everyone's imagination and attention over the last couple of weeks. Cheryl, of course, being given her freedom from the institution after almost a 3-week period, a judge making that order over the weekend. Further assessment will be taking place this Friday when she comes before Magistrate Vashist Kukram. And, you know, many people are concerned about the damage that has been done to her particular reputation and also to her work career. And speaking of work career, Daryl Joseph, a certified employee assistance provider, discussing things from the workplace perspective and the fact that an EAP provider could have been an option that the organization could have tapped into.
Yes. And
we were looking, just before we took the break, looking at you know, the chain of events that ideally would have taken place had this been accessed. So let's continue. You were outlining the ways in which the EAP not just helps the employee, but also helps the organization deal with potentially dangerous and troubling situations.
Yes, as consultant, as should have been in this case. All right. So let's make a couple of assumptions. Assumption number one is that there had been no prior, let's say that there were an EAP involved, and assumption one is that there had been no prior intervention by an EAP with respect to this individual, okay? So, because I'm hearing, again, stories about there having been a long-standing issue, and I don't know if anything had happened prior, but I'm assuming that at this point in time, when the confrontation took place approximately nearly 3 weeks ago now.
Yeah, almost 3 weeks ago.
That there had been no prior interaction with EAP at all, okay. So the confrontation happens, and the employee assistance provider is called and told there was a confrontation with the individual. Questions, first of all, will be asked as to exactly what happened. Okay? It's very important to ascertain what words were used, what actions were taken, anything that can build a minute-by-minute, almost transcript of what transpired. And why that's very important is because issues where there might be a perceived threat of some danger or some harm, we need to determine very early whether there's reasonable suspicion to believe that the person either has acted violently or aggressively or that they can do so. Because if there's a very clear threat of violent words, behavior, or actions, this primarily becomes a security issue. And why I say a security issue is because at that point, what you need to do is to get the individual away from the other persons that they may do harm to.
We've heard from the head of the psychiatric unit at UWI's medical school, Dr. Hutchinson. He's argued the point that there may have been, or there generally are, red flags that go off. There are signs that you look for that would have displayed themselves before you have an explosion taking place, such as the one that would have been described in this instance. So if there was any sort of action or activity like that taking place, that's one of the first things that the EAP provider would want to determine, that there may have been red flags or some warning signs that the organization would have seen but probably missed or misunderstood. Yes.
Now, it's really interesting, and I'm glad you brought that up, because as it turns out, training of managers and supervisors in how to recognize and what those red flag signs are and how to recognize them and what procedure to take should you see them is part of the standard EAP services. So whenever an EAP is introduced to an organization, and I do these all the time, there are two things you do. There's an orientation for all employees where we talk about the program and how to use it and what it's for, what it's not for, and so on. Then there is training of all those responsible for employees in what the red flag signs are, what to look out for, how to recognize them, and most importantly, what to do should you see those signs. So the idea here is that the EAP will prevent these things from happening if it is enacted properly.
Let's talk about some of those red flags that management needs to look for, and not necessarily with regard to this specific case that's dominating the headlines, but general red flags that the organization needs to be aware of that would hint that a particular employee may become a danger, not just to themselves, but also to other people on the job, to their work colleagues, and that they may very well explode on the job site, because not always would someone explode on the job site. They may actually be taking out whatever issue that they're dealing with on their family members at home. But we're looking specifically now at the red flags for the job site.
Okay. Now, it's very important to ascertain the difference between somebody who may have, let's say, an eccentric personality and somebody who behaves normally one way, and then you notice a change in their behavior. So, for example, let's say the person, you know, they may not necessarily be the loudest and most outspoken person, but they enjoy a cordial friendship with the other people around them, and, you know, you see them chatting with people and you know, being, you know, interacting and so on. And then all of a sudden, this person keeps to themselves. You notice they're very somber.
They become withdrawn. Yeah,
they become very withdrawn. They're very quiet. Or the opposite, they become very aggressive and very easily irritated, and they, you know, always, you know, gunning for people and snapping at people around them. You notice a change in their behavior. That's the first thing that you look out for. So looking at somebody who normally is withdrawn and very into themselves and very quiet and saying something is wrong with them, you may be very, very much incorrect, because that person may be just simply a quiet person who doesn't engage with people on a regular basis. So
what you're looking for is a major personality change.
Change in behavior. Change in behavior, okay? And I've had instances where people have referred persons, and when we have a conversation about it at first, because I always talk first about it, they will say, well, the person's always quiet and don't talk to anybody. And my question would be, so is this how they normally behave? You met them like this? They say, well, yes. I say, so what's the problem? Maybe they're just quiet and don't like to speak to people. And that's very different, as I said, from somebody who normally is a part of what goes on, and then you notice a change, okay? So the first thing you'd look out for is is a change in their regular behavior. And then you look out for, well, what actually are those changes? Being withdrawn is a big one, because that is associated usually with depression. Being very angry or aggressive is also a big one, particularly with males, because male persons tend to demonstrate depression by acting out angrily, okay? Anger is like the face of depression that you see, particularly with men. So men who you find very edgy, very easily irritated, as I said, and very quarrelsome and aggressive language, aggressive posture and behavior and so on, you want to note those things. Of course, if you see an employee who is very teary, you notice their eyes are red and they always seem like they're on the verge of crying or they're upset, those are also red flags that you look out for. And normally, gentle, mild person who all of a sudden becomes very aggressive and, you know, using a lot of aggressive language and so on, you would look out for that. Of course, if a person, well, I shouldn't really tackle this now, but if a person is using, for example, expletives and making threats, then, you know, very clearly something is wrong, because that's not considered normal employee behavior anywhere.
And making threats against specific people in the organization, or anybody in the organization.
Right. So going back to relaying the story and how it should have unfolded had there been an EAP, the first thing your EAP provider would want to determine, is what is the level of threat. All right? If, for example, the employee made verbal threats, I will do for you, I will fix you, I will kill you, or whatever it is, all right? Had made verbal threats to an individual, that's a very serious issue.
You don't know me. I know so-and-so.
Yes.
I will bring down my click for you.
Yes.
That kind of talk.
That kind of talk, all right? You cannot, especially in 2012, you cannot take that kind of talk lightly. That's a very serious issue. And the first thing you want to do is to get that person safely away from everybody else that they may do harm to. So, and usually in government offices, usually there's some kind of security employed. I shouldn't say some kind of security. There's security.
Yes.
All right? There's security employed. You would want to utilize the security service to get that person away from everyone else. All right? Now, again, I'm not an expert on how long they could be detained for or this kind of thing. But why that's important is two reasons. One, to get them away from, to minimize the threat that they may do harm to somebody else. And two, to provide the opportunity for a professional to do some kind of assessment of them, perhaps on site. And a responsive EAP will make the arrangements necessary for a qualified person to do an assessment of the person on site.
Okay, so there is that option that someone could have been called in to come in after the explosive situation that took place, to come in and do some on-the-spot counseling right there.
Assessment, which is a little different from counseling, but
assessment.
Yeah, you have the idea is correct. Yeah.
Okay, and if need be, after assessment, to do maybe some initial counseling while making arrangements for the person to be removed from the building or the workplace entirely.
Yes.
Okay. In terms of the witnesses to that explosive situation, they too would need some help from an EAP, wouldn't they?
Perhaps. Again, it depends upon the severity of the explosion. Unfortunately, in Trinidad and Tobago, we are accustomed to people talking loudly and cussing and carrying on and thing, right? So chances are a person stands up to management, for example, the person may be hailed as a hero, and there wouldn't be any significant trauma to the other members
in
of
another
staff
place,
around.
in another country, they may be considered as going postal.
Yes.
But that's part of the course here in TNT.
I mean, I'm not trivializing the situation, right? But I'm just saying that the severity of impact also needs to be determined. And if it is a situation where people are genuinely traumatized, then yes, usually in that instance, some kind of group work would be done with the employees who witnessed the incident. Sometimes you would hear the term critical incident, debriefing, and so on. That kind of activity would be done with the other employees to sort of settle nerves and get people calm, get people to talk it out, and just leave people in a level place so that nobody is unnecessarily traumatized or stressed out by it.
This is Ctntworld.com, a classroom session with a certified employee assistance provider and a psychologist, Daryl Joseph. We're going to take a quick break and give you your Playway Pick 2 draw and then come back with more. Welcome back to Ctntworld.com. I'm Jesme Vento, in with you this evening. And in with me this evening is psychologist and certified employee assistance provider Daryl Joseph. And he's arguing the point that in the Cheryl Miller case that we've all been following with bated breath every day to see what's the latest development, he is saying that perhaps an effective and efficient employee assistance program may have been able to help in that particular situation, maybe even to avert the explosion that may have taken place on the day in question when Cheryl was admitted to the St. Anne's Psychiatric Hospital. Just before we took in the break, we were going through the steps that would have been followed had an EAP provider been available and also accessed by the organization in question. And the first argument you're making, Daryl, is that an EAP would have been able to determine from the employees and the supervisory staff there, were there any red flags?
Yes.
Any signs that something may have been coming?
Yes.
And when the situation exploded, how serious a threat was posed,
very important,
not just to the individual who lost control at that point, but also to everyone around them who would have been there to see that situation happen.
And as I said before the break, a minute-by-minute transcript, so to speak, of what happened would be very instrumental in determining the level of threat, all right? Because it is entirely possible that we may determine, or an EAP professional may determine that, look, the person was just venting. There's no particular history of violent behavior prior to that. Since the words have been issued, the person has calmed down for themselves, and they've gone back to the normal work mode. So there's not a very strong threat of some kind of violent action taking place in the very near future, okay? Now, if so, again, so there's a first determination, which is the level of threat. If we determine that there's a potential threat of violence or harm to self or to other people, call in security, let security remove a person, not necessarily from the building, but from the other colleagues that they work with, to somewhere safe within the building where they can probably be assessed by an employee assistance professional who can make themselves available to be on site within a short period of time.
And where they can't possibly harm themselves as well.
Right, so they need to be monitored also, okay? In the instance where there is no serious threat of violence, this then primarily becomes an HR, a human resource issue. Because if you have a person who is speaking to a supervisor or manager in a way that could be considered insubordinate, then that becomes a human resource. The human resource policy is very clear on things like that, okay? So what should happen ideally in that instance is that the person should meet with human resources. They should be held accountable for their actions. If at that point there is any suspicion that the person may be going through some personal issues that may be fueling the way that they behaved, there can be a suggestion, and we're going to need to go into some detail about this, all right? There can be a suggestion that the person see the employee assistance provider.
Let's go to the Cheryl Miller case very quickly. One newspaper report indicated that after the blow-up in the office with the supervisor, Cheryl Miller was in the process of writing a letter of apology for her behavior when the medical officers from the St. Anne's Psychiatric Hospital were called in and took her away.
Yes. And I found that very interesting because, again, I don't want to... I really try very hard not to judge on situations unless I have all of the facts in front of me. Because the last thing I want to do is to be accused of, you know, speaking emotionally or speaking about things without knowing what actually happened. But I will admit that it is rather strange behavior for someone who may be considered a security risk, that they would have been sitting down, what is it, writing an apology?
Yes.
Right? That's not the normal thing that you would expect someone who is a threat to other people in the building to be doing. I'm not saying it can't happen, but I'm just saying that that's not what would normally happen.
Okay. So we've assessed the level of threat. It may be a very serious threat level that the EAP has determined, and the person has been isolated in a space by the security officials at the organization, in a space where they are being monitored for fear that they may harm themselves or try to harm someone else. What's next?
All right. In that instance, like I've said before, what should happen next is that an on-site, ideally on-site, assessment by an EAP, a professional, a psychologist, psychiatrist, or so on, an assessment of their mental status should be made at that point in time, because the determination of their mental status will drive what kind of recommendation for further action should be taken.
And that's where the suggestion or the recommendation come in. Well, what's the difference?
Okay, hold on a second. I'll get to that just now, but let me just deal with this. In the instance where, as I said, it's determined that there's a security threat, an assessment, a mental status assessment, is performed on the employee. If the person performing that assessment is not a psychiatrist, because psychologists and counselors are not medically trained, and the powers that they have are a little bit different, okay? If the person is not a psychiatrist, but there's reasonable suspicion that the person may be suffering from some psychotic disorder, mental disorder, they can make a further recommendation that a psychiatrist do an assessment on them. If a psychiatrist does a further assessment and the psychiatrist determines that there is a very real, there's a serious threat that the person may be suffering from some mental disorder, under the Act, the Mental Health Act, Section 7, admission of an urgent,
an urgent admission patient,
right? A psychiatrist can make a recommendation that they be admitted to a mental institution as an urgent admission patient, okay? And the requirements for that are very, very clear in the Act. This is available on the internet. It's from the Legal Affairs website. The application can be made by any person who alleges that the person in respect of whom the application is made is mentally ill. And the second thing, the person shall be accompanied by a certificate of a medical practitioner other than the medical officer admitting the person. So that's where the psychiatrist could make a certificate of from a medical practitioner, and they could make a referral for inpatient treatment at a mental institution.
Okay, so we assess the level of threat. We determine whether the person is actually suffering a psychotic break or not. And the counselor or EAP or psychologist would be able to determine whether there is need for further assessment by a psychiatrist or who is a medical officer that will then be responsible for recommending and admitting the individual to a psychiatric institution.
Now, even if a psychiatrist recommends that they be treated at an institution, there's two different kinds of treatment at an institution as well. There's inpatient treatment, which is where the person has to stay, And there's outpatient treatment, where the person visits, just like you would visit any other professional, medical professional, and usually some kind of medication would be administered, and they'll monitor the person's behavior and performance and make changes accordingly. So what I want to highlight is a number of different possible scenarios that could take place before you get to the stage where the person is admitted as an inpatient, okay? And this only happens where there's a determination that there's a serious threat of violence. If it's determined that there's no serious threat of violence, as I said, this becomes a human resource issue. They can make, and this is where we could talk about this, they can make a suggestion that the person visit the employee assistance provider.
What is the difference between that person suggesting that they visit and recommending that they visit?
Right, okay. So there are two basic ways that an employee will utilize an employee assistance plan. There's the first instance, which is what we call voluntary submission, and that's where the employers, has some issue that is bothering them, and they decide. So they contact the EAP confidentially on their own, and they go. We're not dealing with that instance here. What we're dealing with is how can a supervisor or someone responsible for other people get somebody, let's say, to access EAP. And there's two different ways. There is a supervisor, what's formerly called a supervisor-assisted referral, or SAR for short. And an SAR should only be made if the person's work performance has been documented as deteriorating over a period of time.
So they make a definite recommendation that this person should probably seek this kind of assistance.
Based on their work
performance.
Okay? Now, we have to be very careful about how we define work performance. Mm-hmm. Okay? Because you can take work performance to strictly mean end results. So if I'm an accountant, are my accounts correct? Do I get all my work in on time? Does that satisfy work performance? Okay,
we're going to get some more detail on this aspect of it right after this break. This is Ctntworld.com. Welcome back to Ctntworld.com, where today we're having a bit of a classroom session with a psychologist and certified employee assistance provider, Daryl Joseph, looking at the Cheryl Miller case. And Daryl Joseph is arguing that perhaps an EAP may have been able to play a role in averting what some are calling unmitigated disaster that surrounds the Cheryl Miller situation. Just before we took the break, Daryl, you were explaining in terms of calling in an EAP, that the organization can make a recommendation based on how the employee has been performing in their job over a period of time. If they see some sort of deterioration. That they would recommend that the employee seek EAP assistance.
Yes. And again, this has to be documented, okay? Because when that kind of recommendation, when that kind of referral is made, when a formal referral is made, the first thing the EAP will want to know is what is the person's work performance history, where are the areas they have deteriorated, or what has happened leading up to this point, all right? And that's one thing. There's another way that a supervisor can get somebody to go, which is a little less rigid as a formal referral, but it's what I would call a supervisor-suggested referral. And that's where a supervisor who ideally has a good working and trusting relationship with their employee will tell them something like, look, I think this might be something more than you could handle on your own. And I mean, this is entirely confidential, but there's the employee assistance plan that's available to assist where I can't assist or where other people in here can't assist. So I would suggest very strongly that you give them a call, set up something, and try to see if you could deal with whatever it is that might be affecting you at this point in time.
Going back to the Cheryl Miller case, we've heard from PSA President Watson Duke that this lady would have worked her way right through the ranks in her public service career over a period of 20+ years. And that there was no indication from the quality of work that she was putting out that there was something wrong. And one of the major issues at play there is the fact that the performance management system either is not functioning properly across the public service or has not been fully instituted across the public service, so that there would have been no way for the supervisory element to track or pick up any trends in terms of her work performance that would have hinted at, that would have provided a red flag then for them to look at before they took such an action.
All right. There's the letter of the law and there's the spirit of the law, okay? I would suppose yes, to the letter of the law, if there's no formal, performance management system in place, then it would be very difficult, near impossible, to determine how somebody has performed. But I think more in terms of the spirit of the law, a person supervising another person over a period of time will know whether the person's work performance is consistent and up to a certain standard or whether it has deteriorated. And I mean, it is a judgment call. And when it gets to unfortunate situations like this where it has to be battled at a legal standpoint, there will be ramifications if there's no formal process in place. But I would never tell a supervisor to wait until a performance management system is in place before you tell an employee who is going under, call the EAP, right? I would never tell them that, because on a real world basis, you would know, a person would know, okay? So yes, there should be a performance management system in place, and it should be, formally well documented and all the T's crossed and the I's dotted and so on. But in the real world, it may not necessarily happen that way. And I don't think that should stop the person from receiving assistance from the EAP when it is necessary.
Let's backtrack a little bit in terms of the steps that would have been taken once the red flags were recognized and the explosive situation would have taken place, and the person then isolated to protect themselves and the other colleagues in the workplace, and the EAP brought in to do an assessment, and if need be, a psychiatrist consulted to do further assessment to determine, just how deadly the threat is, whether they're having, just an episode or it's a major psychotic break or so on and so forth. At what point are family members brought into this entire scenario?
Good question. The Act itself doesn't cater for that, and an Act can't cater for every situation, all right? So when we don't have, formal wording to address things like that, obviously the humanitarian or caring, for want of a simpler word, perspective has to take precedence. And in an instance where it has been determined that an employee is in urgent need of some form of medical service, the caring humanitarian thing to do is to contact the person's family ASAP and inform them of the situation. There are some clauses in my practice as a counselor where I can break confidentiality. And one of those is if somebody who is in a counseling session falls ill or some sort of medical emergency comes up, I then have permission to contact their family and let them know, look, this has happened to the person. I'm making arrangements for them to see this professional or go to this institution. And I would use the same sort of a spirit to guide what should happen in a public service situation like that.
So let's go back to the specific case now.
Yes.
Ideally, what should have happened is if when the folks at their workplace called for the professionals from the psychiatric hospital, a call should have been made almost at the same time to members of the person's family to say, something has happened here at work. We've had to take this drastic step. We need you to be there with the person.
Absolutely. Yes, I mean, come on, it's people we're dealing with here. It's not bricks and blocks and, inanimate objects. This is human beings we're dealing with here. And I can't think of anybody who in that situation where a family member of theirs is being taken somewhere for treatment, I can't think of anyone who wouldn't want to know and wouldn't have a right to know. It's a human being we're dealing with here.
Now, based on the reports that we have coming out, apparent, and also information coming to us from the PSA president, she appears to have been fairly isolated during her stay, which may intimate that her situation may have been a very serious one.
I will not attempt to discuss anything that happened during her detention at the hospital, because that, I imagine, would have been guided by whatever assessment was done on her while she was an inpatient. And unless we have details about that assessment, which probably wouldn't happen because that would be confidential anyway, it would be very impossible, it would be very difficult to say whether the treatment was appropriate or not.
There are those who are arguing that this is a test case for us to take another look at our mental health legislation. Also, employee assistance, you're arguing employee assistance policies and some other bits of legislation governing this type of scenario.
Yeah, it's very painful for me as an employee assistance professional to see this kind of thing happening and not to have a voice to be able to make some kind of intervention, because this is what we do. This is the kind of situation that we're trained for. It's like if you could imagine emergency responders to a medical emergency and not being allowed to go to the point when an accident happens and actually get the victims to the ambulance or, the hospital and so on. It's frustrating. Because you're seeing things happening and you know it shouldn't be that way.
We have a saying here at home, when your neighbor's house is on fire, wet your own. Other institutions looking on at this case, this is the perfect time for them to explore all the different options that are available, not just to help the employees, but also to help the organizations
yes.
as well.
Yes, because we need, you see, adults spend the majority sometimes of their time at their workplace, and your mental health, your state of emotional wellness will be significantly impacted by what happens during those hours at work. And that actually leads into another topic, workplace bullying. All right?
We're saving that for another day.
Which we will save for another day, right? But it's very important that if we want our country to be well, that our workplaces be places, places where people can be well also, and it fosters that kind of thing.
Daryl Joseph, I want to say thanks for spending time with us on Ctnt World today with a very interesting classroom session, as it were. If you want to talk to Daryl, you can do so via Facebook. He's at facebook.com/DarylJo, that's DARYLJO. If you would like to get a consult with him, you can call his hotline at 622-4509. That's 622-4509. He is a member of the Psychologists Association. He is also a certified employee assistance provider. Thanks very much for being with us on ctntworld.com today.
My pleasure once again, Jesse. Thanks.
That's it for today's edition of ctntworld.com. Up next, we've got a major news bulletin from the CNews Center here at TNMG. Stay tuned.